A year after a US-led initiative to lift tens of millions out of poverty and hunger in Africa was launched, we examine the new Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition. You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Rattansi. The alliance was formed at the 2012 G8 summit led by the United States. Its stated goal to reduce hunger and lift 50 million Africans out of poverty over the next decade. It sounds like a noble effort among wealthy nations, African leaders, and international corporations to increase private sector investment in agriculture. But critics say that's precisely the problem. Several NGOs and civil society organizations say this solution focuses too heavily on private investment and is the wrong solution to a complex and growing hunger crisis. Among the concerns is that smallholder farmers could be pushed out of their land to make way for large, powerful international corporations. Earlier, I spoke to Jada Doyen McKenna. She's the Deputy Coordinator for Development for Feed the Future. That's the arm of USAID that's coordinating the US's involvement in the alliance. She explained the goals of the initiative and argued that safeguards were in place to protect local populations.
The new Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition is very simple. It basically aims to bring together African governments and the country, citizenry more broadly through consultative processes, so civil society, local farmer organizations, with development partners and with private sector actors, both local African companies and the international private sector, to work together to sustainably and in an inclusive way reduce poverty and undernutrition in African countries.
All right, so to help us visualize this a bit more clearly then, let's get to the ground level then. Who owns the land that will be cultivated through a public-private partnership?
You know, every country, the land tenure is slightly different, but obviously you want the land to benefit the smallholders and for the good of the people and the smallholders that farm that land every day. So in some cases, there's common tenure of land through government. In other cases, there may be private smallholder farmers that own that land and that are working it. And in other cases, there could be larger commercial farming going on.
Right, so what's the oversight? I mean, we've had lots of reports, for example, in the Côte d'Ivoire of enormous agribusiness, taking over tens of thousands of hectares. I mean, how does that mechanism work? What happens to those who are already on the land, for example?
Yeah, I guess it's important to take a step back and to understand what the new Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition is. Countries have signed on to it, donor partners have signed on to it, as well as individual companies, both the majority of them being local African companies and international companies. All of the actors who are part of the new alliance have agreed to abide by different land tenure and land tenure agreements that are in place. So the voluntary guidelines on responsible land tenure and the principles for responsible ag investment that have been negotiated by world governing bodies. So, it's important to talk about individual instances of what's happening. And in some cases, I think some of what you described may be happening outside of the new alliance, but things that are happening within the new alliance, the parties that have signed on to the new alliance have agreed to abide by international standards. And the fact that they have signed on and are working in an open, transparent manner helps to make sure that we continue to revise those processes and to be in discussion to make sure that we get to great outcomes for all
So that
parties.
couldn't happen then, that an international company could just come in and say to the government, make a deal with the government to get tens of thousands of hectares of land and push all the smallholders who are already on there out. But it couldn't happen in the new alliance.
It should not happen, and the point of the new alliance is to really bring all parties to the table and to do so in a transparent way so that we can have a collective dialogue about how these agreements work so that they benefit all parties.
So what recourse does a smallholder have if that is happening under the new alliance?
The smallholder needs to work with its government. Their smallholder farmer associations are very active in the new alliance. Individual smallholders are empowered through their country's laws that help them. And we, the public, and others hold companies accountable for their behavior. Companies need to be good citizens in the areas in which they work. It's not sustainable for them not to be.
We should boycott rice companies that aren't respecting the laws?
No, these are very complicated, complex agreements. And I think it's easy to say right? It's easy to have a soundbite that says this big company must be doing something evil to a smallholder
No,
farmer.
we just want to know.
We must benefit. We must
Absolutely
boycott.
not. I mean,
but
there's certainly a role for private. We're just making sure that there are the mechanisms in place for transparency
there's a
and
role
oversight.
for civil, exactly,
Yeah.
and that's exactly what the New Alliance aims to provide: transparency, oversight, and also open platforms for the best outcomes to happen for all parties.
But how open is that platform? How much of a say does the local community in any given area have in what's going to happen in their agricultural development?
I think local communities are part of the solution. Look, it is not sustainable for anybody to come into a community and not work with the local community and to think that they can have a thriving business and keep growing. It's in the best interest for the companies involved. Many of the companies involved in the New Alliance are African companies themselves. So this is their country, their countries, their land. They care just as much as everybody else. It's not about an us versus them or kind of breaking us up into different tribes. It's about collectively coming together to develop African
Absolutely, but all we have, though, of course, is the lessons of history. So that's why we wonder whether these mechanisms have been finally thought through. For example, what happens to a farmer who doesn't want to take part in the New Alliance, on whose land then patented seeds, for example, Monsanto seeds, for example, what if those seeds blow onto his land or her land, actually, because given that these are mainly women, actually, a lot of these farmers. Is there a mechanism?
So the majority of smallholder farmers are women, and so we work to get to women. Look, it's important. There are lots of seeds that are available, hybrid seeds, and in some cases, advanced seeds that use different advanced technologies. There are some patents on those seeds that use advanced technologies. Part of what the New Alliance aims to do is to have the proper laws and oversight and regulations in place so that those technologies can be adopted responsibly, and also training for farmers and other people so that they can be used appropriately and responsibly. You know, in the U.S. we have the largest organic agriculture in the world, as well as the largest use of other technologies like genetically modified. Our farmers have choices, and we believe those farmers in the developing world should have the same choices.
Have studies been conducted, though, into the effect of these new patented seeds into local variety, into genetic diversity of crops, into the water usage, the effects on the local environment? Have all these studies been done?
Of course, there have been a lot of studies over the years on biotechnology and product availability, and the studies, there have been many studies over the years.
But specifically, though, for example, genetic rice in Ivory Coast. Just because the studies
don't say what you want them to say does not mean they haven't been done. But the studies have been done. I think they're part of the process of adopting new seed technologies in countries is to test them locally and to understand what benefits those have. And part of what we do is
independent studies haven't been done because these seeds are patented and independent researchers can't get their hands on them.
That's absolutely not true. Independent researchers and scientists absolutely have access to the technology just like everybody else and can run their own studies and look at them in peer-reviewed journals. I think part of the process, though, is working with countries and with universities and countries and other bodies so that people have a common level of understanding to then do the proper regulations and the proper operating environment for those products, and so that then farmers can have choice. At the end of the day, this is about empowering farmers to make choices that are smart for them and for their production, and that's what we're all aiming to do, and that's what the New Alliance, by bringing different actors together, aims to do.
And joining us from San Francisco is writer, activist, and academic Raj Patel. He's also an advisor to the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food. Here in the studio, Gawain Kripke, the Policy and Research Director at Oxfam America, and Michael Clausen, who serves as the Vice President of Policy and Humanitarian Response at Save the Children. Raj Patel, a good starting point might be actually to try and understand why 50 million people in Africa are hungry and poor in the first place.
Well, I mean, if you look at the history of agriculture in sub-Saharan Africa, you can see that it's one of colonialism, followed by a brief period of independence, followed by the World Bank's structural adjustment loans that systematically defunded the state's support for agriculture and government support for agriculture in sub-Saharan Africa. And so when you see people who are malnourished. And when you look at the poverty data for sub-Saharan Africa, you'll find that the majority of people going hungry are women or girls involved usually in farming, in the areas where the development policy establishment, of which the United States Agency for International Development was one, insisted for decades that money invested in agriculture was money wasted. And it's only been very recently that the development policy establishment has come to the realization that if you want to fight poverty and if you want to end malnutrition, you absolutely have to invest in farmers. So it's the new alliance is perhaps a belated recognition on the part of USAID and its partners that what they've done for the past 30 or 40 years has been a disaster, and this is their way of making up for it.
Is it going to work?
No, I don't think it will. I mean, I'm using here the ideas of the Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen, who very recently offered one cheer out of a possible three for this new alliance, because insofar as it concentrates on increasing food production, perhaps that's a good thing, and we can debate whether, in fact, this will result in the kind of food production that we want to see more of. But the reason for hunger is not a shortage of food, but poverty. And without specifically addressing poverty, and particularly without addressing women's poverty, what this initiative is doing is essentially paving the road for large businesses, whether African or international, to be able to have African resources in the African market, rather than addressing the reason why people are poor in the first place, which are a range of reasons due to structural poverty, a lack of opportunities, a lack of investment in public resources and public health and public education, none of which are part of this new alliance's remit.
Michael Clausen, Save the Children is a major supporter of the new alliance, but do you recognize some of those possible problems with it?
No, what I would say is that we're very focused on improving the well-being of children around the world, and we're heartened by the fact that there is this renewed focus on agriculture and also more specifically on nutrition. And nutrition has really been a hidden crisis that has been completely absent from the world scene. So I was in London 2 weekends ago for this Nutrition for Growth Summit, the morning of which was focused on nutrition, the afternoon on this Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition. And I think from my perspective, the question I had in mind is, a poor farming family in Mozambique with a newborn, should they care about what's happening in London or not? And I think there's a lot of speeches, there are a lot of leaders present. I think I took away a fact that I think there's a lot of potential in this, because what you saw in London was not just global leaders getting together and saying we got to do something. It was actually a lot of the African leaders first coming up and saying they needed to tackle the question of agricultural production, they need to tackle the issue of nutrition, and then how can the rest of the world fit in behind them. So actually, I think it's a step forward. The
president of Malawi wrote an op-ed for The Guardian, Joyce Banda, and this is what she had to say. The new alliance is important as my government doesn't just view agriculture as an essential means to attaining household and national food security. We see it as a business through which our farmers can generate wealth, improve their livelihoods, and transform Malawi's economy. None of this can be achieved without private sector investment. Gawain Kripke, Oxfam has a slightly more nuanced approach to the new alliance. But, do these leaders have much of a choice but to take what's on offer from these enormous corporate and international donors? Are other paths to sustainability and food security being offered in the first place?
Well, that's an excellent point. The new alliance, the theory of it, which is to try to engage the private sector to invest more in agriculture in African countries, has some merit to it. But the risk is that it becomes the only vehicle for investment and agriculture development. And the frustration that we've had with the new alliance is less about the new alliance per se than about G8 leaders and other stakeholders basically shifting the responsibility for agriculture development onto the private sector and not taking responsibility themselves.
How are they doing with their pledges already? They have pledged quite a bit of them.
They have pledged, but they haven't pledged new money. This is the frustration with the Obama G8 summit last year. There was a pledge that happened in 2009 called the L'Aquila Pledge that happened with the G8, where they pledged new money into agriculture development, public sector money into agriculture, and they refused to make new pledges at that G8. Instead, they launched a new alliance, which had really no new money in it. So,
but with the expectation of corporate money. Perhaps.
Corporate money, yes.
Raj Patel, that is quite striking that such a key issue about Africa is taking place at the G8 in the first place, given that there are actually no African countries at the G8. Do we know how these decisions, what say African nations do have in all of this? Are there any quid pro quos going on? You support this new alliance,
you've got to wonder.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, there are people who are saying, well, African countries are not coerced into this kind of thing. But bear in mind, let's take Joyce Banda, let's take Malawi. Malawi has had devalued its currency for various largely bad reasons. And so debt has now swelled from about 35% to over 50% of the national income. Joyce Banda needed money, and this was the only carrot being dangled in front of her. Now, one doesn't have to fantasize or have a conspiracy theory to suggest that there was quite a lot of pull as well as push towards adopting this kind of policy. And the trouble is that actually the question you asked just now was the right one, which is, what are the alternatives? What do we have instead of this? And G8 countries and development agencies aren't offering any, even though there are plenty of studies out there suggesting that actually what we need is not the kind of public sector, sorry, not the kind of private sector interventions that are coming from the fertilizer companies or the pesticide companies or the biofuels companies, which are the largest investors here, but instead a different kind of farming that addresses absolutely the issues of malnutrition and child malnutrition in particular, but do so in a way that are much more sustainable, much more climate change ready, that are much cheaper, but don't surrender everything to the private sector, but in fact rely on building the kinds of institutions that ensure that distribution is the way that we address the distribution problem. We address the mechanisms by which poor people are able to access food, rather than sort of signing off the private sectors, giving Africa away. And some African civil society groups have actually said, we don't want this new kind of colonialism. Instead, what they want is a way of making their own systems of agriculture much more sustainable, much more carbon-free, and much more socially controlled than the New Alliance is letting them do.
And I suppose, Michael Clausen, that the worry is then that in having the best of intentions, we are going to make the situation worse. And there was the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food, of whom Raj Patel is an advisor, I believe, then, said that one of the main principles underlying the New Alliance, which is the concentration of land in fewer and fewer hands, is not a sustainable way to end. He said this in 2011, though, before the New Alliance. But he wrote, accelerating the shift towards large-scale, highly mechanized forms of agriculture will not solve the problem. It will make it worse. It will further exacerbate an already highly unequal competition between large-scale industrialized types of farming that can take over markets, but also produce vast social and environmental externalities, and small-scale farming on which many rural poor depend for their livelihoods. This could cause massive social disruptions in the rural areas. I mean, does this, when you put the weight and the credibility of Save the Children behind this project for this new alliance, doesn't that concern you, that this could be making things worse and actually exacerbating the problems that cause child malnutrition in the first place?
I'm putting the weight of Save the Children not specifically behind the New Alliance, but for global leaders standing up and doing something about child malnutrition, and this being one possible avenue. I think at the end of the day,
it's interpreted to Save the Children's support.
We welcome the fact. I mean, what we're welcoming. Look, when you look across the world, look at what's happening to official development assistance levels that are stagnant or dropping. So there's a clear question in the world that we're in: how do you find other sources of resource to help grow more crops and also grow more nutritious crops? So it's in that frame that it does make sense. Government's not going to be able to carry the load alone. Point one.
Imperfect solution and imperfect system.
And then point two is eventually it's all about the accountability framework through which this is going to work. And so you'd want to, from a Save the Children perspective, we're very strong believers in having national solutions at the national level, so a country ownership where governments and civil society in a country figure out how to take this forward. Right. And that's what you want to have built into this New Alliance
structure. But is it?
I can't tell you, we don't track this, today, tomorrow, Wednesday. We don't track that aspect.
They're using Save the Children as a reason, as a sense, well, look, this is really a great initiative.
I don't know that they are, but I mean, we're speaking out, like I said, we're speaking out in favor of the fact that there's now attention being paid to child malnutrition, new resources going to that area.
Gwen, let's look at accountability then. I was trying to ask the representative from USAID there about that. At the local level, we've talked about whether the political decision makers, how representative they were able to be. At that local level, is there a structure about how business and government and local farmer are going to interact within this project? I've seen a lot of talk about voluntary guidelines, but is there anything that gives us faith that this is going to work this time?
Well, that's the concern and the real frustration, that we have leaders and presidents meeting in London or Washington and actually saying quite positive things about farmers as entrepreneurs, farmers delivering wealth into the country. These are important statements by leaders. But when we actually have done site visits to try to see, have farmers themselves been consulted? Is this meeting their needs? There seems to be quite a disconnect between what's being said in London and Washington and what the farmers are even aware of, whether they even know that these new alliance agreements have been made, what the content is, and whether they feel like they can access the benefits of it.
What about this issue of land grabs? I mean, are there safeguards against that?
The land grabs issue is huge, and with food prices going up and land becoming more scarce, there's ever more pressure from investors to grab land, and not just foreign investors, but local investors as well. There's some hope that the new alliance might actually help provide some normative guidance by adopting these international guidelines like the voluntary guidelines and so forth. So within the new alliance, there actually may be some help to try to make sure that investors and governments abide by these guidelines. But outside the new alliance, it's still the wild, wild west.
Right, but they are voluntary guidelines and based around governments who are rather, as was suggested, they kind of have to go along with this in some ways if they want any influence.
If I can chime in on that though, but, if you look at one of the largest investors in the new alliance, they're a Tanzanian firm that used to be a Swedish firm, but now is classified as one of the African companies that's driving this forward, and they're interested in biofuels, and they're in the moment. Currently, I've been reading reports about how they are at the moment. There are big protests in Tanzania around their land grabbing. And they may or may not be compliant with these voluntary guidelines, but civil society has already come out against these voluntary guidelines. I mean, I think you have a civil society organization like La Via Campesina, an international peasant movement of 200 million farmers, who find something very deeply troubling about the new alliance. They've said very clearly that the frameworks incorporated within the alliance lack transparency. These are insufficient, they're inadequate. But the alliance goes ahead anyway, saying, no, we're fine, we're transparent, we're going ahead transparently. I mean, what good is transparency if the whole point, if you're going to just march over the heads of people who are protesting against you?
Just to follow up on another point from our interview that aired just a moment ago, USAID then very clear that there had been studies on the possible environmental effects of patented seeds on these local environments, and studies have been done. Have they been done, Raj?
There's been one large farm-scale trial that the United Kingdom has done around genetically modified crops, around looking at certain, comparing genetically modified crops with conventional agriculture. But the deep, interesting comparison between agroecology, between a rich kind of polycultural system and genetically modified crops hasn't been done because what we've seen, we've certainly seen that polyculture is a way of providing much more nutritious food, particularly for children, around the world, and those kinds of systems are systematically
what do you mean by
stamped
polyculture,
out by the
Raj?
new alliance. Polyculture, so instead of growing a monoculture, instead of growing one crop, you're growing a variety of crops, crops that are good for fiber, for fuel, for nutrition, for vitamins and minerals in some respects, for enriching the soil, for bringing in beneficial predators. And these rich agroecological systems are not profitable for large businesses, but they can return much more. And we're doing research at the moment in Malawi around some of the fantastic gains that a rich polycultural system, unfunded by this new alliance, but supported by a number of civil society organizations, how a farming system like that can actually be much more robust for eliminating malnutrition and ending hunger and poverty.
Gowind,
those studies and those comparisons aren't being done.
Is there a problem there? Is there a fundamental problem with using patented seed technology as a basis for food security for any country, given that those patents aren't in the control of the farmers or the governments who are involved? Am I missing something here?
No, there's some risk in it. As having seeds that are controlled by intellectual property and sometimes have traits that are not under control or that can't be replicated by farmers themselves definitely has risks. Although the farmers themselves have to make their own decisions about it. In the United States, of course, a lot of farmers have chosen to go GMO. And I don't think it's for us to say whether it's a good choice or a bad choice.
But we're talking about choice, and as we've heard, though, that forum for informed and free choice doesn't seem necessarily to be in place.
Well, that's right. And a lot of developing countries have very weak regulatory systems, poor systems for evaluating the benefits and risks involved, and very weak public sector education and extension systems agriculturally. So we really need to build those up institutions so that farmers can make good choices and have the support to make those choices.
Michael Kloss, it's a matter of trust in some ways. We have to now trust that the US government and the large agricultural and agribusiness firms, the multinationals, do have the best interest of Africa at heart within all this, while of course they need to satisfy their shareholders. Do you think that they have that credibility?
I think the question we're all wrestling with is this going to make things better or is this going to make things work? And the fact of the matter is that we don't yet know. What we do know is that for the new alliance, they've put a very clear outcome on the table of 50 million people out of poverty. And that is that's stated there, it's explicit, and I think we all hold them clearly to account. And if that number goes down, then progress is being made. From our perspective, the real, sort of the gap in this is okay, it's food security and nutrition. What's the target for nutrition? You know, what's the map? How do you know you're getting closer to the destination you wanted to get to or the outcome you wanted to get to in nutrition? So as this accountability framework is elaborated, that's what we want to see.
Very quickly, Raj Patel, then, if we don't know yet, Raj, in this framework, is there scope for a plan B once this plan A, if and when this plan A doesn't seem to have worked? I mean, once they've introduced all this new technology to these economies, once they've transformed these economies?
Well, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I share Michael's mystification of why the hell, I mean, what exactly is going on here. But I do want to say, I mean, 50 million people coming out of poverty, that's the number of people who are food insecure right here in the United States. I'm not sure the United States is in a great position to be teaching the world about food security when there are 50 million people food insecure right here at home.
Raj Patel, thank you very much. Michael Clausen, thank you. Gawain Kripke, thank you very much.
Thanks.
That's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now.